Any further speakers to the bill? The honourable member for Banff Cochrane.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm very pleased to speak in support of Bill 24, the Forest and Prairie Protection Amendment Act. I'm very honoured to be a co-sponsor with the bill, and I'm very appreciative for the minister's leadership. Congratulate him on this first piece of legislation, and I think he couldn't have picked much a better topic to pick his first bill on, and so I'm really pleased to be part of that. Of course, I'd like to thank the first responders who keep our communities safe. I know that forest communities like the ones in Banff Cochrane and particularly where I live in Bragg Creek, that when fire season comes around every year, people get pretty nervous. They never know what's going to happen. And it's interesting because there's a bit of a tension between people being afraid of a flood risk and a fire risk, but both at opposite ends of the hydrology spectrum, as it were. But I do know that the forest communities can rest a little easier because they know that we have such professional people looking after us that are going to be keeping us safe and ready to jump into action. I'd also really like to recognize the volunteer first responders. Of course, the professional responders are the people who do this day in and day out, but it's not just the professional responders who keep us safe. There are people like Eric Butters. He is a councillor and the Deputy Reeve in the MD of Bighorn. He's also a rancher in the Ghost Valley near the beautiful communities of Benchlands and Wypress. I know that Mr. Butters would probably be the last person to call himself a hero, but I would be the first to say that he is. Him and other volunteer first responders just like him. He's told me some stories about how he's jumped into action on very short notice and put out very small fires that could have otherwise escalated into much bigger events. And so it's having people like him and others throughout our communities who, he might just happen to be at home having dinner one night and he gets a call and he has to go and respond to that immediately. And it's people like that who are scattered around our communities who have the ability to respond very quickly to those kind of situations and put out fires before they become a bigger issue. There's also communities that border the Ghost Valley public land use zone. And there's, accidents that happen all the time in these communities. People have accidents with their off-highway vehicles, or, sometimes they're, despite their best intentions and best actions, sometimes their fires get out of hand. And so they need some help extinguishing those. So these volunteer emergency first responders, they put their life on hold at any time of day or night, and sometimes they don't know when they're going to get called. I guess that's the nature of the business. But I'd also like to, there's another sort of category of volunteer first responders, and those are people like in the Ghost Lake Village and in Redwood Meadows. We have an example of volunteer fire stations. And they're people just like you and me. They have day jobs where they work, but they volunteer their time after hours keeping their community safe. And I'd really like to acknowledge those people because I think they deserve a lot of credit. Another aspect of our public service that I'm really proud of is the fire lookout towers. I'm lucky to have 3 of those towers in the constituency of Banff Cochrane. They're located at Moose Mountain, at Barrier Lake, and Kananaskis. And there are dedicated individuals who sit on top of these fire stations and take weather reports and observe the forest all day long looking for signs of risk. And so if it weren't for these dedicated public servants, again, there could be a lot of other risks that we would face, and so I'd like to thank them as well. When we talk about communities that are at risk for forest fires, especially the community of Bragg Creek has been identified along with other communities like Slave Lake and Fort McMurray at a high risk of forest fire. And so, Bragg Creek is one of the 3 remaining communities that hasn't yet experienced a fire. And, fortunately for Bragg Creek, but it's certainly a risk for the community. And so one of the things that I'm really proud of our government doing is funding an emergency egress study. So if you're familiar with the town of Bragg Creek, there's on the west side of the river, there's really only kind of one way out, which is the bridge over the Elbow River. And so our government has provided some funding to Rocky View County to study different ways that we could plan an emergency egress route. And so there's a lot more work there to be done, but I'm glad that we're taking steps to address the concerns of the community. All across Banff Cochrane, pretty much from Cochrane all the way to Lake Louise and all points north and south as well, all of these communities are at high risk for a forest fire. Albertans and tourists alike go to these communities for the exact reason that they're covered in trees. And, this, of course, puts them at risk as well. A lot of these forests are old growth forests, so there's a lot of debris and duff, as we've heard from a member across. And so there's certainly a high risk there. But one of the things that we certainly encourage to reduce that risk is the Fire Smart program. And the communities across Banff Cochrane have engaged in activities, Fire Smart activities. I know Canmore and Bragg Creek have done a lot of work on this. In Bragg Creek, in particular, the fire department went door to door actually and made sure that everybody in the community knew about the plan, and if they had any questions or needed any assistance, that the fire department was available to them. The little community of Waiparis, which is sort of northwest of Cochrane, was actually awarded a Fire Smart grant because of the work that they've done. And I was just looking at their website actually, and they post almost quarterly newsletters to their residents talking about the different types of activities and emergency planning and that kind of thing. So there's a really good example of communities taking action and making sure that people know what the risks are and how they can respond to those risks. So I'd like to get into a little bit more about the bill rather than just talking about what our communities are doing. Of course, we've mentioned before that the purpose of the bill is to protect Albertans and their communities from the threat of wildfires. And the amendments that we're proposing here are supported by recommendations that were made in the Flat Top Complex report, as well as the last 2 fire seasons. So for people that may not have heard of the Flat Top Complex report, this was a report that was based on the lessons learned from the 2011 Slave Lake fire. And a lot of those, or either almost all of those recommendations are adopted here in this bill. Of course, we've mentioned before, it's been said in this House earlier, that unfortunately human-caused fires are the most common. There's a high rate of human use in Banff Cochrane, which is great because people are getting out and enjoying the outdoors. It's close to Calgary, and people like to take their off-highway vehicles there and go camping or whatnot. And that's a good thing, but we also want to make sure that people understand the risks of enjoying the outdoors and make sure that they take steps and understand the consequences if they don't do their part to keep our community safe. The bill strengthens our laws that enhance wildfire prevention activities. It supports our wildland firefighters and keeps Alberta communities safe. If we can prevent fires from happening in the first place, we don't need to put our first responders at risk. And so if we can stop fires from happening, that's a good thing in itself, but we also keep our first responders safe. One of the things I'd like to talk a little bit about is just about recreational off-highway vehicle use. We've talked about that a little bit before, but one thing that I'm really proud of is to have the cooperation of the off-highway vehicle use community. I know that this is a very responsible group. They know that they like to get out and enjoy the outdoors, but they also know that they have a role to play in keeping our community safe. And so I'd like to thank the off-highway vehicle community for their cooperation when we do, from time to time, need to restrict off-highway vehicle use. Madam Speaker, the proposed regulations, from what I've been made to understand, also include a ban on what's called incendiary targets and also fireworks on public lands. This is a piece that I'm particularly proud of because members in my community, including the municipal district of Bighorn and the Ghost Valley community, had brought this to my attention early on in 2016, that they were concerned about the use of incendiary targets. In the Ghost public land use zone, there are often people that like to sight in their guns and get ready for hunting season, and that's an acceptable use in that area. But one of the risks that the community members identified to me is with these incendiary targets. So these are targets that when you hit them, they explode, and there is a risk of that explosion causing a forest fire. And so in this bill, or rather in the regulations that would come afterwards, is proposed to have a ban on incendiary targets. So it's because of the actions of the community, the Ghost Valley community and the MD of Bighorn who brought this to my attention. I in turn shared it with the minister, and I'm sure there are other groups as well, but this is something that the community can really give themselves a pat on the back for standing up for themselves and making sure that they brought this to our attention. And that brings me to another point that, when we're talking about forest fires, when you look at a forest from a distance, it just looks like there's just trees out there. And I think what sometimes people forget is that there's a community in there. There's people living amongst those trees. And, because of the, acreages may be, very low density of houses, but certainly there's people living there, and they want to rest easy at night knowing that they have adequate protection from forest fire, and that people are going to be there when they need them, and they certainly are. But they also want to know that we're doing our part in making sure that we have laws to ensure that people understand the repercussions of forest fire. Of course, tourism is another big economic driver in Banff Cochrane, and people don't like to see burned out forests. They want to, it's just that a nice intact green sea of green trees is something that is attractive to tourists from all around the world, and we need to do everything we can to protect our forests from that. Of course, forest fire is a natural part of the cycle, and so we can't just suppress fire completely, but we do undertake activities like prescribed burns. These occur on a regular basis, and I know that there were a couple just occurring either over the last couple of weeks or even right now throughout my constituency particularly. And I know that we've got fire experts that are responsible for managing those prescribed burns, and that's something that also not only protects from a larger forest fire, but it also protects communities. And it's actually also really good for wildlife, too. Wildlife like to live on the edges of things. And so, if we have a kind of homogeneous forest, that doesn't necessarily allow for the type of habitat that is amenable to a high biodiversity in wildlife. And so, prescribed burns and managing those fires accordingly is a way that we can also help with our wildlife. Of course, the forestry industry, as the member for Peace River mentioned as well, is we want to make sure that we're taking actions to protect the assets of that belong to all Albertans, but are harvested by our forestry industry partners, and that's something that we is contemplated by this legislation as well, keeping those assets safe. With that, Madam Speaker, I think I've touched on a lot of important points as it relates to my constituency. I'd like to thank all the members for the debate we've had here this afternoon. And with that, I'd like to adjourn debate on this particular bill.